All right, well, welcome everyone to our first Ball Field Chat Live. We wanted to amp up kind of our normal weekly Twitter chats to do this new live component. So here we'll be conducting interviews, answering your questions, and hopefully, digging a little deeper into some topics that came up earlier. As always, we have your panelists. We have Luke Yoder, Paul Zwaska, Andy Ommen, and Tom Burns, and I'm Molly. And we are also joined tonight by Evan Mascitti and Dr. Andy McNitt for a special interview. We'll be discussing the exciting and important research project they're currently working on. If you have any questions you'd like us to ask during this live half an hour, feel free to tweet us. Just remember to use the hashtag BallfieldChat, and we'll get those answered for you. So I'd like to start out by having Evan and Andy introduce themselves. So Andy, if you'd like to start.
Sure. I'm Andy McNitt, professor of soil science at Penn State University. Consultant for the NFL. I help to run their field certification program and technical advisor to their grounds organization, and director at Penn State of the Center for Sports Surface Research, as well as our undergraduate and online programs. Evan.
Hey, I'm Evan Mascitti. I'm a PhD candidate at Penn State in soil science, working with Dr. McNitt right now. Prior to coming back to grad school, I worked at a variety of different sports turf facilities, ranging from Little League with Paul all the way up to the major leagues. And I wanted to just real quick, I wanted to shout out the sponsors who are helping us out with our research project, and they are the Keystone Athletic Field Managers Association, the Pennsylvania Turfgrass Council, and the SAFE Foundation through STMA. All those groups have been really generous to Dr. McNitt's research program over the years, and I'm grateful to be supported as I work on my degree and also have some funds to actually do the research. So thanks to all those folks, definitely, and thanks to you guys for having us on.
So what you're saying, Evan, is it's really to get you your degree is what this is all about. Is that what you're saying?
Well, it's a combination of a lot of factors that conspired together to kind of bring me back to where I am now. So definitely, but yeah, never forget my start at West Madison Little League. That's for sure.
Well, we appreciate you guys coming on tonight with us on our inaugural show, our inaugural live show, and I know the bulk of us here on the panel are really excited about this upcoming research, and I'd like to have you guys fill us in a little bit more detail about what the research entails, what it's about, what are you looking for, that kind of thing, if you would.
Go, Evan, go.
Yeah, definitely. So can we start with the definition of engineered soils? That was something else that you had thrown out. And I think that before we discuss the particulars of what we're trying to do, we ought to make sure that we're kind of all on the same page. So the way that I think about what an engineered soil is the word engineered. It really just means taking two things and adding them, or more things, adding them together to get a new product that doesn't exist in nature. And if you look around you, these kind of materials are everywhere. So all the metal alloys that are in your phone or your computer, the gasoline that you put in your car is spiked with usually some octane so that your engine will run smoother, and your clothes, they're usually multiple kinds of fabrics. And so when you think about like an engineered infield soil, what you're trying to do is combine natural materials and to make them, engineer them for a specific purpose. And that is to combine sort of the best of both worlds. So to just real quick, to pivot to sort of like a food analogy, Molly, who's the sort of the brains behind all the technology and running this Tuesday night chat, I think, is a big participant on the Foodies of Turf Twitter feed. That's seen like a lot of activity, a lot of traffic the last few weeks, which is cool. People are taking advantage of the quarantine to cook more and stuff. But one of my family's favorite recipes, like a lot of other Italian American families, is like Sunday spaghetti sauce. And if you think about the components of spaghetti sauce, you have tomatoes, you have garlic and olive oil and onion, right? And so each one of those things has a set of properties. So tomatoes have some sweetness and some acidity, and sausage might have some savoriness or saltiness. Well, each one of those things is okay by itself, but when you combine them together in a pot, you get something that's much more than the sum of its parts, right? And so it has properties that really don't exist on its own, and the different components kind of balance each other. So that's kind of how I think about engineered soils, and it's a pretty popular buzzword. And certainly there's a lot of people who have been working on this topic, most of who are on this call, long before I was around. So don't for a second think that we feel we're creating the idea of engineered soils out of thin air. But there's sort of two objectives of the project, and I sort of chuckled when you sent the question, what are the objectives of your research? Because if you ask a scientist that, you better buckle your seatbelts. You might never get them to shut up. But there's sort of this first thing is to come up with a better way to measure the performance of infield soils. So if you are an experienced groundskeeper, you kind of know when your infield is correct. You can feel the firmness underfoot, right? You can jam the key in and watch it come out cleanly. You can watch the cleat dimples, and you can see the way that the ball bounces during batting practice and throughout the game. And so intuitively, we can kind of all observe this. And it kind of reminds me of that famous or infamous statement by Justice Potter Stewart, like, you can't define it, but you know it when you see it, right? And so you can observe these things, but when you go to try to explain it in more objective terms, it gets a little tougher. And if you want to use numbers to describe it, it's impossible, because there's no metrics at all to quantify the cleat in, cleat out effects and ball response and the firmness of the soil. We have the Clegg hammer, but that's really kind of a different tool. And so that is the first objective, is to come up with a way to measure this phenomenon in the lab. And we want to do it on a relatively small soil specimen so that we can repeat it. And we want to use a machine instead of using human subjects. If you really want to isolate the soil component of this problem and not consider the different size of athletes and different kind of cleats that they wear, you really need to use a machine as opposed to human subjects. And when you do a research project, if you bring people into the equation, there's all kinds of, it's a whole can of worms that you really don't want to open at a university level, because you have to get all kinds of approval to get them to run around in your plots and whatnot. So
and humans aren't consistent.
That's correct. And so that's the idea of doing it with a machine, is it's a very repeatable motion over and over with the same amount of force applied. So we're actually in the process of, we have built this device with the help of the engineering services machine shop. And I'm going to see if I can just share one image of this. Molly, am I allowed, do I have permission to share my screen here?
Yeah, you should be good.
Okay, so let's try that. This one. So this is,
there he goes.
You guys see the presentation
It's
view?
working well. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So this is a rendering of this device, and just in sort of a visualization. So you've actually got this pneumatic cylinder, which is what provides the power, the motion. And then we have an angled plate, and then this cylinder is the actual soil specimen. So the material is packed into here at a specified density. And then rather than rotating the player's cleat, the relative motion is actually done with the specimen. So this is on a hinge. And if I go to the next slide, you'll be able to see a little bit more carefully. We've cut the cleats off of a real baseball shoe, just like it's I think this was an Adidas brand, but very similar to what's used by a lot of athletes. And so once the device is actuated, you can see there's a little bit of a torquing action. So you can see how it rotates. And as the cleat impacts the soil, let's see. Yeah, so it's said on Twitter that if you don't post a super slow-mo, then it didn't happen. So I thought I thought that I would throw this one in here as well. And so this is how this device works. You can see that actually there's an angling, and as this cleat sort of comes out, you know, this mix is pretty dry at this point, and so it kind of splashes the conditioner and pulls out this chunk of soil.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the idea, and there's a lot of going back and forth between ourselves, and let me stop this, and the engineering services shop, and they're really incredible machinists, but they don't work at the same pace that most other people do. So, you know, we really just got this back right when this virus situation was starting to go down, so we're just kind of starting to play with that.
Well, I'll add something. You know,
yeah, please jump in.
I can't have a graduate student do a project unless we invent a new machine. Apparently,
that's right.
It's always be that way.
It's a long lineage of angle iron and funny names, definitely. So
That your perspective and definition on engineered soils was enlightening. I mean, now I think of those recipes my grandma had for spaghetti sauce and all that. Maybe it was engineered spaghetti sauce. I don't know.
yeah,
I'm getting hungry. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, no, I hear you. And your objective,
Back to SpaghettiOs.
you're hitting the nail on the head, and it's easier said than done, and very interesting. I appreciate you sharing that with us.
thanks.
As your
Kind words.
performance, but when it comes to engineered soils, how would you relate, in the 60s when the USGA came up with the first engineered soil for golf greens, and how that's prevalent now in sports fields, and it was installed in professional sports in the 90s, long before engineered soils were for infield mixes. How would you relate the two?
Yeah, so I think it's obviously they're for very, very different purposes, but this idea of creating a formula where you're going to capture the beneficial properties of both things is the same. So the reason I'll put this verbatim the way that Dr. McNitt likes to say, we don't build out of sand because it doesn't compact. You can compact sand really easily, but even after you beat on it with a roller, or people running over it over and over, or golf carts, it still retains pretty large pore spaces, and so you've got lots of air in there. But sand is not so good for growing plants in by itself. And so while we appreciate the firmness and the drainage properties, we have to do something about that. And so peat or compost or other types of organic amendments are much better at holding water and holding nutrients, but they're very soft. You would never be able to construct an entire sports field out of an elastic material like that. So by mixing those two things together, you're getting the best of both worlds. You're getting the stability of the sand and the high infiltration rate, but you can still grow plants in there. So I guess if you try to relate that, analogy to infield mixes, the standard approach now is to blend some sort of sand with some sort of fine textured soil, and we'll just call it clay for the sake of the conversation. But of course, we know that most fine textured soils have particles that fall within all three ranges, sand, silt, and clay, in some percentages. But generally speaking, you're trying to capture sort of the properties of sand, which is sand is very loose and friable, it's brittle, it breaks apart, and clay, which is more cohesive. And I like to use the word plastic, which is a word that is used in civil engineering to describe the consistency of soil. So you're really trying to capture the best of both of those properties. If you think about what would happen if you built your whole infield out of mound clay, I mean, you can get cleat in, cleat out playability. Sure, it's going to, when you have the moisture content perfect, it's going to be really stiff and awesome. But what happens if you get a chunk out of there? If you have any kind of imperfection, you're not really going to be able to fix that, short of taking a DuraRake, and a vibratory tamp to your whole infield and smoothing it out again. So I think that's how I kind of relate the two, is you're really just trying to capture the essence of both the sand and the clay, I guess.
Yeah, and while they're two totally different designs, one you would not want to grow any type of grass on, the other one you would. But when it comes to the benefits, and they're different, but performance and how, relating back in the day to the transformation of from push-up greens to USGA greens, and the consistency in the weather, the consistency in maintenance. You could teach it in the classroom. I mean, before the groundskeepers on a golf course, if they were there long enough, they were so valuable because they could maintain each green individually. It was all different across the country and on each golf course. So the consistency and performance, I guess, was also what I was getting at, even though it's two totally different materials that you would not want to use in either aspect.
Yeah, totally. And Dr. McNitt has obviously a long career in engineered turfgrass root zones, and I think he's pretty up on some of the early players in that part of the business. I actually have done, this is what I do in my spare time, a little digging into the history of baseball. And it's funny, actually, like the attempts to fix infields go back a lot further than we might commonly realize. There's this guy, Harry Wright, who was the guy who founded the Cincinnati Red Stockings, which was the first ever professional baseball franchise. And there's this letter that he wrote to one of his friends in 1875 describing like that his infield was too loose and he wanted to firm it up. And he was trying to till in he called them finely pulverized ashes and sawdust and like all kinds of stuff to try to get his infield to perform better. And so it's taken us, up until 2005 or whatever to maybe get a little better at it. But I had a question for Paul, actually. I don't know, I've never really asked you this. Where does the 60-20-20, that's kind of what we've all thought of as the standard. Where does that come from? I mean, was that something you came up with? Is it Pat Santarone? Where did that come from?
Tom and I were talking about that just a couple days ago, as a matter of fact. And, I believe that came around to be a generally understood optimum back in the 60s, 70s time period. And like Tom and I were discussing, just because it was 60-20-20 didn't mean every 60-20-20 soil worked, because you don't know what the distributions of the sand was in them. And so some of them worked and some of them didn't. So it was still a little confusing to people as to why their 60-20-20 didn't work versus somebody else somewhere else had a
60-20-20, and it wasn't. It was far from that. They just called it that. Nobody knew because they didn't test.
Well, that's true too. The one thing that I learned pretty quickly coming out of college and starting to deal with soil manufacturers was a lot of them didn't really understand anything about baseball, about infields. They were just there to sell soil. They didn't really know sometimes what was in their soil, and it was, their soil was whatever it was you wanted it to be. Yeah. Hey, do you got an infield soil? Oh yeah, I got one. It's right over here. The next guy comes in the door and says, hey, do you have a garden mix? Yeah, I got the pile right over here. Same pile.
Right.
And to a certain degree, that a lot of that's still true today. You see a lot of that, and it's I think a lot of it is that there just wasn't enough information back in those days. I mean, because I've just been writing a little bit about the history of infields in the past month or two as well. Infield soils, and when you look at it, baseball got started before you even had the land grant colleges out there. So there was no science there for them to know anything about soils.
Right.
And it took decades before there was enough information. Andy, what year was the Penn State turf program started? I bet it was the early 60s.
Oh, no. It was started in the 30s, 29,
Really?
I think. Yeah, so
Okay.
it depends what you mean by the Penn State turf program. So the research started in like 27.
Okay.
And then the educations didn't start, the formal education, until the 50s. And then we didn't have a BS degree until the early 90s. You had to get a BS in agronomy.
Yeah.
So Evan, before we run out of time, you did a great job of explaining objective 1, which is the machine and trying to put numbers to it. But I think objective 2 might interest these guys a little bit more.
Yeah. So let me hit objective 1A, which is related.
Sorry, long-winded. You're gonna have to shorten this.
This is only a half-hour show, Evan.
No,
Told you it's gonna go quick.
So if we're gonna say the optimum moisture content for your infield is this cleat in, cleat out moisture, let's just pick a number. Let's say it's 12.2% gravimetric or 25% volumetric, whatever. Well, then the question becomes, how much more water can you add to the skin before it gets too soft? And this is a totally different problem, right? And it's really a more severe problem because everybody wants your infield to be cleat in, cleat out, but you can still play on a dry infield. But if your infield is too soft to play on, too wet, you have to cancel the game. And this has financial implications, whether you're a major league stadium or a little league. So we're going to have to come up with another test, and we don't have time to get in the weeds on what that is. But it's going to have to do with what is the water content where there is a given, I'll use the word strength. The engineers don't like to use that word. They like resilient modulus as a more technical term. But what is the water content where that strength is lost? Because that's going to also be different for every soil. So now you have a range, right? You have the low end where you've watered the skin up to the point where it's going to be cleat in, cleat out. And then you have an upper end, which is where it's too soft to play on. And so that range, that water content range, whether it's 4%, 7%, whatever it is, that's your Goldilocks zone. And that's what you're shooting for. So then the question, this becomes objective 2, if you can kind of separate this out, what is a way that you can extend that range? Can you use different materials? Can you blend them in a different ratio to actually make that range wider? And if you have a wider target, then this makes your job as a groundskeeper a little bit easier.
Right. So what are the dials you're going to turn to test that and figure out if you can make that wider?
So I think everybody understands, if you've worked with different materials, that all clay is not the same. And we kind of treat and talk about clay as if all clay particles are equal. But we know that they are different sizes. We kind of just differentiate the sizes to silt, being between 53 and 2 microns, and clay is anything less than that. But the smallest clay particle is only 10 times the size of an atom. It goes down basically to virtually zero. So there's some other techniques that we're using to characterize the size distribution of the clays, and then also the different mineralogies of the clays. And so that's definitely one lever or dial, I guess, so to speak, that we're interested in. And then the other thing is that based on what kind of clay you have, it may be that the percent sand and the percent clay are not absolutes. When we talk about a recreational mix being 70% sand or a professional mix being 60% sand, well, those are on a weight basis. That's how we measure particle sizes, on a dry weight or mass basis. But when you have this discussion about how the soil is occupying space, whether you have sand grains with large pores between them that are getting filled in, that's a volume discussion, and that's much different, and because it depends on the relative densities of those two components. So that those ratios are not necessarily an absolute. It has more to do with the components that are in there and how those have to interact with one another.
So I've got to ask this question. Your second part of your project, was this brought on by a mistake you made back in Little League? Because this sounds exactly like what happened when you overwet the fields once, when you came back to help out with Johnny and Eric, and you flooded the field and then walked away, and they got stuck fixing the field the rest of the afternoon.
I think I stayed and helped. No, well, so one thing that Paul, that you taught me that has never left me, is that your infield, a lot of times it plays the best when it's right on the edge of kind of going off the cliff.
Yep.
And I think that all groundskeepers, that's what it takes doing that one time to understand how much it can really take, right? And I think we've all had this experience, if you've been in the business long enough, where you roll the dice and you leave the tarp off, and you come in the next day and you wake up in the middle of the night and there's a thunderstorm. And sometimes it ends up not working out, but there's other times where you make it and you look at the field and you go, man, this is really playing better than I thought. And so there's something to be said for getting right up to that edge, but obviously there is a safety concern of going past there, and you always have to be conservative and make sure the game is played.
I think you make a good point with the working with the moisture content. If you can get a range in there, so we know, at this point it's going off the edge. At the lower point of that spectrum, it plays really good, and then that would give us a range to play with. Because there's a lot of times when you get the field ready for a 7 o'clock game, but then the dew point goes up, and the field actually gets wetter through the game, or you can get some unexpected weather in. So it just gives people a better idea of the moisture range that we can use.
The only problem with that, Tom, is that every soil is different.
Well, yeah, and I think that's where all this research and everything, and we've come light years, but there's always going to be a feel aspect. I mean, even with dealing with your turf, you could have the USGA greens and things like that, but you get a feel of, I need to put water on it today.
Right.
You can't take the feel out, and I think, but this engineered stuff and the quantifications that you guys are going to do through this is going to help us that much more and make that the people who have that feel even better.
Absolutely.
And
So it gets you off on the
You
right
can't take the feel out. I agree.
No,
you can't take the feel out, but we can create a bigger buffer for you. Maybe.
Exactly. That's what I'm saying.
And you can quantify it. So
it's exciting. I
kind of think of
it is.
Just to drop one last silly analogy, but I think of this like when you go to a real fancy restaurant, they bring you just like this, nice, tall, skinny glass, right? Well, the server has to come back and fill it up every 5 minutes because it's so small. So that's like, as a groundskeeper, if you have a small range of water content, you have to be constantly out there hosing it down, putting the tarp on, taking the tarp off. If they would just give you a bigger glass, this person wouldn't have to come back so often to fill it up. They could fill it up without overspilling, right? Without going past the point where you want to. But then during a day game, when it's going to be dried down, you've got a long ways to go before it gets too dry.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of this idea of having a larger range.
On a quick note, you were talking about the 60-20-20. And I think, Paul, where that came from was, probably in the late 80s to early 90s when people started sharing information a little bit more. They identified the fields that were good. So people started testing them. And I think that the 60-20-20 range, or put it this way, the good infields came out to right around that kind of a spec. And I believe that's how that spec evolved from there. That was the range that we're looking for. There's other variables in there too, how you work it and sand distribution, like you were saying. But I believe that's how that spec started. When people first started testing good infields.
That's kind of where the USGA specs came from as well. Observation at first.
Yeah.
And they tested some things and said, hey, it looks like it's about this. And then slowly over time, it kept evolving.
Yeah.
You worked for one of the earlier branches of the Bossard train. Is that right? I remember you being on Paul's podcast a while and talking about that. Was it Amel or what?
Yeah.
Amel was the father. I worked for Harold for a little bit. He retired shortly after I started there, and I worked with Marshall.
Okay. Did Marshall have like a certain, like a secret sauce, like a blend that he liked or kept secret or something?
Yeah, it's just, we got dirt from this one pit, and we would mix it up with some sand. And when I first started there, we used as a top dressing, we used mason sand. Calcine clays were just starting to be used on infield skins. We used the old Terra Green on the football field in the bench areas. When it got muddy out there, it was a native soil field. But then we started using the calcine clays as a top dressing on it, and it just evolved from that point. But we take it back into the Stone Age deal. I was talking to Paul about this. We'd take dirt, we'd get it moist, we'd ball it up in our hands and throw it on a concrete floor. If it shattered in a million pieces, that it might be a root zone. It wasn't good for an infield. If it broke apart in 2 or 3, 4 pieces, something you might want to investigate on an infield. And if it held together, that might be good for the mound and the plate.
Yeah.
And that's just, that was just a field way of quantifying something before we had any kind of testing. And it's all evolved from that point. We used to mix up mound clay. We actually used pottery clay and mixed it up in a bathtub and made it into these big clay balls. We'd roll them out in the center field and dry them down to a certain point, and then put them in a bucket with a wet towel over it. And that's what we used to fill in the mound and the plate.
Good. To go back to that question of the 60-20-20 mix that we had, that I had at Oriole Park with Pete. Back before I became head groundskeeper with the Orioles, during Pat Sanderon's time, they had football there, the Colts, before they moved to Cleveland, Indianapolis. And they used to, their infield soil was actually the sod from the year before that they stripped from the football field. So after every football season, they would strip the entire field at Memorial Stadium. They would take that sod, shred it up, add an inoculant, and compost it for a year, and then screen it, and that would be the infield soil for the next year. And they became well known for their infield soil. Players around the league loved it. And so once I came there 2 years after football left, and then I worked under Pat for 5 years, and then I took over. And I was trying to recreate what they had there before. So I kind of had to think, okay, well, what would they have had? Well, obviously with that, there would have been a lot of organic matter.
Sure.
So that was the reasoning behind bringing some peat into it, which ended up adding 2 things: moisture holding capacity and a corky feel to the infield. And I remember one, I was telling Tom about this the other day. I remember one game against the Tigers where Sparky Anderson called me into his office, and I thought, oh, what is he going to complain about now? And I go walking in there in the visitors clubhouse, and he brings in Alan Trammell and Lou Whitaker, and all 3 of them are raving about the infield. And there was that mix was what it was. So that's where that's why I bought the peat into it.
Yeah, pretty cool.
Yeah, no doubt. And I think we need to wrap it up, and I'll kind of close it out here. Going back to that field tom, what you did, and I was even doing that even at PNC, and you grab a handful, and if you drop it and it busts into 2 or 3 pieces, it's a good infield mix. It's a 60-20. If it stays in one or sticks on the wall, maybe it's a mound mix. We were, you know, it was an art. It was an art back then. And I could only wish to go back in time and have this type of research going on. You know, that was back in 2000, 2001, PNC Park, and Andy McNitt came with the entire family, pulled up there in the bus and all came out, and we saw the turf grass, and I was just as happy as could be. He did all the testing for us on our engineered root zone. It was phenomenal, but I didn't know the problems I had on my infield skin at the time. I don't think he did either. But you know what? You guys are doing research on only 10% of the playing field, but it's where over 70% of the game is played. So we can't wait for it. We're excited about it. We really appreciate you guys joining us, and we'll do this again soon. You guys all on Twitter, if you guys got in on this, appreciate it, and look forward to doing it again next week.
Cool. Thanks so much for having us.
Yeah.
Thank you, guys.
Other closing
Thank you guys. Appreciate it. Yep.
All right,
Remember-
thanks, guys.
Yeah, you want to remember, research takes a long time. We're not going to have answers tomorrow.
Hey,
How about next week?
Yeah, well, give us at least
Okay.
a couple weeks.
I'm pretty sure Paul just said he invented dirt. So
I thought you said he was older.
I
than
was
dirt.
born in the year of dirt.
Yeah. All right, guys,
All
take
right,
care.
well,
Thank you.
thanks.
Thanks
Thanks.
everyone for joining.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
bye.
Thanks.